Hi there, I'm Jim.
And I'm Claire.
Let's talk teaching. Welcome to Let's Talk Teaching, a podcast from the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology here at Illinois State University. I'm Jim G. Joining me today is Dr. Claire LaMonica, our director here at CTLT. Hi, Claire.
Hi, Jim.
So today we are continuing a discussion we began a couple weeks ago, which we're kind of putting under the umbrella of teaching in times of crisis. Last time we talked about national crisis or kind of big crisis that affects the entire community and how do you deal with that. Today we're talking about something a little smaller and maybe a little less easy to define.
I think so. I think today what we want to focus on is a crisis that might affect your class directly. So, for example, your students lose a classmate. You lose a student. Mm-hmm. From time to time, you may lose a colleague. Your students lose an instructor. And someone has to go into that classroom and follow that.
Right.
So, deal with the aftermath of that.
Right.
So this kind of thing that can catch you unawares, mm-hmm. but it's not outside the bounds of possibility that it might happen. Because, in fact, it does happen.
Sure.
If not every year, then
Sure.
many years.
So, again, the scale of what we're talking about today is kind of working within that community of learners
Yes.
that you've hopefully built. What are some of the things that we can translate from what we talked about when we're dealing with big events that also apply in dealing in crisis in this sort of smaller setting?
That's a great question. I think the biggest message is take care of yourself.
Uh-huh.
And we talked about that a little bit last time,
Mm-hmm.
and I do want to mention it again because it's like when you're on an airplane and they say, if the cabin suddenly loses pressure, the air masks are going to drop down, and you should put on yours before you start helping the other people around you.
Oh, yeah.
And it's basically that rule of take care of yourself first.
Mm-hmm.
So in either situation, I think you want to be a little attuned to how you're dealing with this and what it's realistic to expect of yourself in helping your students deal with it. Mm-hmm. So that's probably the main thing. And I think similar to what we talked about last time. Last time we talked about how there were three sort of major modes of response.
Along a continuum, right?
Sort of along
Yeah.
a continuum,
Yeah.
that there's the stoic response, which is just an acknowledgement that this event has happened and an explanation of why you're going to move on with the course.
Right.
There's what was that word that we used? An
Empathic, right,
an
yeah.
empathic response.
Yeah.
Which is sort of helping students process, and yourself probably, all of you sort of going through the process of dealing with this emotionally together and helping each other through it. And then there was this integrative response, which was actually integrating the event into the course content or integrating it with the course content.
Right.
And so any of those, again, might be appropriate in this case. Mm-hmm. And I think, once again, the big thing to remember is that students aren't going to care so much what you do or how you do it as that you do something. So even that recognition that the event has taken place and moving on is preferable to just moving on and not saying or doing anything.
Right. So I presume that if a student in my course dies, someone's going to tell me that.
Yeah, that wasn't actually always the case, but
Yeah.
it is the case now.
Okay.
And because we're always living and learning, right?
Right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so what happens now is that you will be contacted by the critical incident response team here on campus.
Okay.
So somebody is going to, probably by email, somebody is going to notify you that a student who's enrolled in one of your courses has died.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we're kind of our examples are focusing on that kind of tragedy, but I mean, it could also be a student who's been in a serious accident. I know that
Yes.
we've had,
Yes,
the
it doesn't
last
have
few
to be a
years,
death.
A couple years ago, we had students who were in a really bad car crash on campus. It doesn't have to be a death. So, as people are listening to this today, keep in mind that there are other things. We're kind of talking about the extreme example,
right?
Because I think it's the one in some ways that we dread the most as teachers to have to deal with. But there are going to be other situations that probably fall under crisis. Sorry, I'm using air quotes on a podcast. Crisis, that are not necessarily dealing with mortality.
Yes, thank you for that. That's very true.
But, that also leads to that sort of discomfort with the whole idea. When we were talking about this in preparation for doing our first podcast on this subject, you had mentioned that a few years ago, before I got here at CTLT, we used to do a workshop, and it had a great title. The first part was "But I'm not a counselor!" Exclamation mark. Yeah, I had an exclamation mark, right? But I'm not a counselor. And I think that really does sum up that sentiment. So
it does.
Once you recognize that there is a crisis that needs to be dealt with, what do you do? You
may not feel at all prepared to deal with this. You may actually be dealing with some pretty complex emotions yourself.
Sure.
Losing a student is, I think, a particularly traumatic event in the life of an instructor.
Right.
I think you need to be aware of your limitations and understand that, no, you're not a counselor. You probably have not been trained in dealing with the kind of emotion that this is going to elicit in yourself and certainly in your students who may not have experienced this kind of crisis in the past. They're younger, so they, some of them will have, but some of them may not have had, they may have had fairly safe lives. So I think it's really important to remember that, no, you're not a counselor and you don't have to be. Nobody expects you to be. So in this case, particularly, it's okay to actually call the Dean of Students' office or to call Student Counseling Services and ask to have someone come to your class.
Okay.
And that's okay. You can even ask for help in breaking the news to your students. So the students aren't going to receive an official notification like you do.
Right.
So you may, in fact, be the one charged with breaking the news if you feel that's appropriate. And you have to decide if it's, if you have a large lecture class where there are 300 students, and one of them has been in an accident, been injured, even been killed, you're going to have to take the context into account.
Right.
The students who sit right around that student might know him or her, or, they might be friends. But the class as a whole may not even be aware of this person. So, you need to know. You kind of have to know your class. You know whether students know each other in your class or not. And sometimes in large classes they do, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes in small classes they do, and sometimes they don't. But in any case, ask for help.
Yeah, and I think it would be good not knowing what the reactions are going to be in some cases, not knowing maybe exactly how well they might know each other. Although I will say in this day and age, I always suspect students are going to know that before I do because they're so connected through social media.
They may very well have. They may already know.
But
they
I
may
guess
come to class knowing.
But I guess we can't assume that.
Yeah.
We can't bank on that. We can't rely on that. So if you felt like in normal circumstances it would be appropriate to notify them or to be that point of, to address it. And as we said, it's important to at least address it in some way when you're dealing with this sort of stuff. When you talk to the Dean of Students' office or the Student Counseling Services, and someone comes in, and then you move on, and you say if you need further to talk to someone further, here's this. What are the other ramifications though for the rest of the semester? What are the other ramifications in the class? What do you have to keep in mind?
Well, I think we all generally try to sort of keep our fingers on the pulse of a class, but it might be particularly important to do that because everybody responds to grief differently. So some students may not be, maybe they didn't know that other student well. Maybe they feel like, oh, well, I didn't know him well. I can move on. And then weeks later might be sort of a hit with the sort of import of this. So I think keeping your finger on the pulse of the class, remembering that one natural outcome of grief is an inability to concentrate very well. So particularly in the immediate aftermath, people may have trouble sort of processing your content. But that might reoccur at various times during the semester too. It might sort of pop up later when you think, that everybody's moved on. So there's that. I think you want to watch how students are doing sort of emotionally, watch how they're doing in terms of their learning. And, the same thing for you. Watch how you're doing and see, maybe even talk to the students about what they need. What do they need?
Yeah, I think that's a really good suggestion because sometimes I think we assume, we're not mind readers.
Right.
And even though you may be relatively close in age to your students, or like me, maybe not, you're not part of, you're part of a community, but not every community that they're part of.
Right.
And so they may be dealing with things differently. So I think that's actually a great suggestion.
Years ago when I was working with the writing programs, I had a pretty young instructor come to my office and say that he had lost a student over the weekend, and he was distraught, and I was upset for him, but I had no idea what to do. And, and he was really searching to figure out what to do. And I finally just said, how can I help? Is there anything I can do? And he said, yeah, you can get us out of that room. Oh. He said, I just don't think we can go back. He said, we were there today and nobody wanted to sit in that seat. Nobody's ever going to want to sit in that seat.
Yeah.
And we don't want to look at it either.
Yeah.
And so, I said, hey, that can be done. And then, that actually turned out to be a pretty easy process. The person who taught in the room next door was willing to trade classrooms. So it was no big deal. But it might be something like that. You just don't know what people are going to want or need.
So it also says to me that one of the other things that it's important to do as a faculty member is not only have that conversation with your students, but maybe go have that conversation with your department chair or with
absolutely
a colleague in the department who maybe has experienced this before. And not that people advertise that necessarily, but your department chair,
experienced colleague.
Yes, exactly. Is going to know what to do and to kind of work it from that angle as well.
Well, and your chair will know what resources are available to you.
Sure.
So we talked about the fact that, student counseling services is there for students.
Right.
There are also, there is assistance available for instructors as well it's called the Employee Assistance Program.
Oh, right.
And you can, you qualify for some free counseling if you just need somebody to sort of process this with. So that's available to you. You or your students are always welcome to call PATH, which is the local helpline. So, don't hesitate. But it doesn't even have to be anything that formal. As you just said, it could be just asking your department chair or asking the person who has the office next door or whatever. Yeah. And if it's a student in a major class, your colleagues are likely dealing with the same issue.
That's a good point too. Right.
This could very well be a shared student, and any number of you might have had that student in your class. If you don't right now, you might have had in the past. So that might be an opportunity for sort of a collegial conversation with others who may be asking the same questions.
Right. So, I look back on my experience as a teacher, both here at Illinois State and at another institution, and I have never had, mercifully, I've never had to go through that experience of dealing with a death of a student, for example. And really, I've had some students who were very ill. They didn't want to make a big deal out of it, and it certainly wasn't life-threatening or anything like that. I've had students get in car accidents and stuff like that, sometimes with the university car. That was always interesting.
Whoops.
That's a different kind of crisis. Yeah. That's a different show. But, so, I find myself sitting here putting myself into a lot of what-if situations. You talked about a younger faculty member who came to you who was part of the writing program. Have you had to deal with the loss of a student or...
Not during the semester I was teaching.
Yeah.
Both when I was a high school teacher and teaching here at Illinois State, I've lost students who were in my class the previous semester or the previous year, but or students with whom I'd had other interactions, in co-curricular ways. But I've never actually lost a student during the semester. It's, knock on wood, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So when we're talking about crisis, like we said, we're not just talking about the death of a student or even illness or anything like that. Are there other examples that you can think of that maybe we need to address in some way?
Well, I did lose a very dear colleague in the English department a number of years ago.
Right.
And that was sort of a department-wide, bad moment. And people had to go in and teach us classes,
Right.
I don't know that I have a lot to offer from that, except, the same thing that I've been saying is, take care of yourself, take care of your students, do what you can, don't do more than you can. If students feel like they want to create a memorial or something like that and they ask you for your help, you may, that may be something that you feel like you can do, or it may not be. It may be a good idea to recommend that they work with somebody else. So I don't know that the specific circumstances are as important as just the sort of general response to a difficult time.
And to remember that we're not alone either in terms of support from our department or from,
Always.
From across the university and what else. So what other things do we need to talk about as far as this topic goes?
I think we've covered it. I don't know that we have to say a lot more except just take care of yourselves, take care of your students, do what you can. Don't feel like you have to do more than you can.
Right.
I just think that's the message we want to leave people with.
And of course, in terms of maybe dealing with strategies in terms of pedagogy or in terms of, if you have to take over somebody else's class and you're not entirely sure what they're doing.
Yeah, that's probably a different show.
That's a different show. But that's also something that we could actually help with. You could come over to CTLT.
Yes, absolutely.
Or, getting into their learning management system and all that.
Anytime it's a teaching related issue, that we're here for that.
Yeah.
So, we're not counselors either, but we do, we get ReggieNet, we can help you,
communicate with your students.
We can help you communicate with your students. We can help you if you have to sort of take over a class mid-semester.
Right.
We have resources and thoughts about that. So.
Well, great. Well, Claire, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim.
And that's all the time we have for this week's episode of Let's Talk Teaching. You can find out more about this episode, including links to some resources at our website at ctlt.illinoisstate.edu. Click on the podcast link in the upper right of the main page. For Claire LaMonica and everyone else here at CTLT, until we talk again, happy teaching.